Yes, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. Obviously, I'm Igbo, and that's the first enigma of my talk. I am Igbo. Am I Igbo? The clip you've just seen is this Norwegian guy who supports one of the Kenyan football teams. It's called Goro here. And he loves this game so much, and it's supported by one community in Kenya, mainly the Luo community, and he's immersed himself in the game and in the language. And if you hear him speak and you close your eyes, you wouldn't know that he's not a Luo person. So I just wanted to share that with you, just to reflect upon something important, because somebody said, is it speaking the language that makes somebody an Igbo person? And clearly, I don't know now whether he's Luo or whether he's Norwegian, or he supports a Kenyan football team, so we don't know what he is. And those are some of the dilemmas of translation and the changing global world. I'll wear my glasses so I can see all of you. I also try to introduce my papers and my conclusions early, just in case you fall asleep. I've had a wonderful 1.5 days here, and what I'm going to do and say here is a bit of an anticlimax, but maybe you need to calm down before going home. But it's been a very, very rich and rewarding visit. I flew from Abidjan, where I live, just to come to this, and I think it's just so wonderful that I came, because I've learned so much. So you're not going to learn much from me, which has not already been said, but maybe what I might be able to do is to draw some of it together and also give us another opportunity to talk again. So I'm very tired. There was a strike in France and I had to stop over there. So I didn't sleep for 48 hours, so I'm really tired. So I myself might fall asleep. But what I wanted to first share with you as what I call beginnings is a number of memories. When I was asked to come and speak, I was very nervous about it because, of course, I'm not Igbo, and I generally dare not venture in other people's cultures. Even I live here in England, and I try my best not to say too much about English culture because I'm not English. But I felt I had to be brave, and there are a number of reasons why I felt that it was valid for me to be brave, to come and stand in front of you, and it's very scary, I can tell you that. But a number of memories flashed as I started to think, what could I speak about? And one of them was the image of Chinua Achebe standing alongside Nelson Mandela. It was a very poignant moment. I don't know if you remember it. It happened a number of times, but it was one of the most poignant memories that, for me, came across about Igbo culture and Igbo-ness. And I began to think of other thoughts, like the acknowledgement by Toni Morrison of the influence of Chinua Achebe on her work, and also about other African writers' impact on her work as an African-American writer. She discusses this language issue as the denigration of Black speech in American literature, and she talks about the lasting impression of Achebe's literature on her. And this definition allowed me also to think of myself as a post-colonial subject and the importance of Chinua Achebe's work in my own life. When we learned African literature in Kenya, where I'm from, we didn't have a feeling that this literature emanated from another culture or language at all. We just felt that it was our own literature. That although there are things that are different, which I've spoken about elsewhere, like the drum, the talking drum, we don't have that. It was clear that it was talking to and about an African experience. The third excuse I have for pretending to stand in front of you is that I have two beloved brothers of mine, and they're actually in the room, Onyakachi Wambu and Charles Umelo. Can you wave and identify yourselves? And over many, many years, they have adopted me as their sister, their Igbo sister, and talk to me about Igbo life as if I am an Igbo person. So I listen happily and nod my head and agree with everything, mostly everything, that they say to me, partly because I understand it as a Kikuyu woman. And Onyekachi and I have developed this theory, which probably is an essentialist theory, but one which is true, that Kikuyu culture and Igbo culture have real historical links. And we're still trying to unravel this, but there is evidence, of course, of our roots in West Africa. And our cultures are very similar, pre-colonial cultures and also the post-colonial cultures. The Igbo community has been through a trauma of a violent kind, which not for the same reasons, well, for the same reasons actually, but at different times. So we also have an affinity to the Biafra War. And I also would like to say that my first awareness of the world when I was 6 years old was the Biafran War. That's my first ever contact with the international world, because I think I was about 5 or 6 years old and began to have a consciousness beyond myself. And that's the first international incident that I knew about the world. So again, in terms of my own memory, I have a strong memory of that being my life. I didn't feel it was another country. I thought these are people like me. I didn't even think about it. I just thought how terrible that people are in such a terrible situation. So I began to understand the real and our philosophical lives as fused, but of course this might be taken as an essentialist argument, but because I've been with them for so long, it's become real. Our conversations are so old and so long that I've had them longer than I've had them with my own biological siblings, because they are my brothers, and really I live here and they live here, and that's my family. As well as many of you, as you have heard, like Louisa is now my family. And I'd like to acknowledge the organizers of this conference, who include Louisa and Yvonne, and I'm going to say something about that, and of course, Anike. And thank you once again for continuing to organize this very wonderful space. So those are some of my claims to Igbo-ness, and I'm going to speak to them about being an outsider and an insider, which we all are. Nobody in this room can claim to be an authentic Igbo person, and I'm happy for you to challenge me after this. And I say it knowing that the door is very near here. Pardon? So I'm saying it guardedly. None of you can claim to be an authentic. And I think Onyekachi spoke about the first Igbo person, just like how do we know that there was Adam and Eve or whatever, the original story of whatever community. In my story, it's Kikuyu and Mombi. Who knows what these things are? But we know from DNA that we are all linked one way or the other. And so I begin with my first challenge to all of us, because I want to talk about translation, which challenges the idea of pureness of anything, and actually posits that we are a continuum of cultures and identity, and that's what I'd like to share with this conference, this idea of continuum, change, and transformation. Another memory I'd like to share with you is that I've been very privileged to work with Igbo scholars that I have met in my scholarship and my life, and I think somebody in the room said that they have an affinity to Igbos, and I'm one of those other people who has an affinity to Igbos for whatever reasons these things happen. And I'd like to pay tribute to them for the sensitivity. There's a very large group of Igbo scholars in the world, and they're very influential to scholarship, and they probably do not know it. And I'd like to start, of course, with Louisa Ekbenike, who's here, Fanuel Egejuru, Professor Emenu, Kirun Zegu. We could all name them, but I'm just naming some of them who I've met physically and who I've known. And of course, we're influenced by Flora Nwapa, who I didn't meet, Buchi Emecheta, who I've met and who's still living here in London, Ifi Amadume, Akachi Ezekbo, Obiora Odechukwu. I didn't meet Christopher Okigbo, and I wish I had. Antonia Kalu, Maureen Eke, Ada Azodo, Obi Christopher Okigbo, Yvonne Benefo, whose wonderful work we've heard here, Okindibe. I know I'm preaching to the converted, but I am an outsider, and I want you to know that we also share and know these people with you. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Chiwetel Ejiofor, and the list goes on. And we don't view them as Igbo scholars or writers or filmmakers. We view them as our own. We view them as African contributors to African knowledge, which we claim as ours, partly because it's in English, which is something that I'm going to turn to briefly. And that's why I wanted to share with you that first image of President Nelson Mandela, and to say to you that your culture, or our culture, my Igbo culture, has a very deep and profound impact on Pan-African identity and on global identities in general, and what people call the African Renaissance, but which I believe is the kernel of the global Renaissance. And we can argue about that. But I think the world is going through a transformation that will require something that we've seen through the germ or gem of what has emerged from such work as Chinua Achebe's work, which Things Fall Apart, for example, is translated into over 60 million copies and over 60 languages last time I checked. So it's widely read, and it's touching very, very many lives. So it's not sitting somewhere in Umofia or somewhere in Enugu. It's traveled the world, and we cannot therefore claim that it's specific. Although its roots are there, it belongs to the world. But my own most important memory, which gives me some permission to speak here really, is the fact that is something that's called the Ngugi Achebe Nexus, of which I'm a direct product, probably one of the rare direct products of that nexus. Many of you may know for a long time that there was this theoretical conversation about Ngugi and Achebe being opposed on the question of language. Ngugi argued that he would only write in his mother tongue, and Achebe argued that, if I can paraphrase him, this is the language that I've been given and I intend to use it. People saw this as a contentional argument. I have gone on to reflect on this, and I don't think so. I think they're speaking from the same side, because what Achebe has been able to achieve with the English language has made it an African language. The idioms, the way it's expressed, the position from which the stories are told are an African and Igbo standpoint. So I think he's speaking from the same side as Ngugi, and Ngugi has gone on to translate his own books. Ngugi was influenced by Achebe in what tone and positioning to write his early books. So they're on the same side of the same conversation. But I became a product of that nexus when I decided to translate Ngugi's work into English. And it's also impacting on my life now as I turn more and more into translating European or African language texts into Gikuyu, which is my mother tongue. It's to Achebe that I turn for style, for norms, for rhythm, and so on. He gave us the gift of how to approach an African written tradition in English or in whatever language. So we're very thankful to that. And we also owe it to the Igbo culture, its richness. And he was recording, of course, a specific moment in time with Things Fall Apart, for example, but that gave us an entry point in which to become ourselves. Of course, that moment in 1958, when that book was written, has moved. We're in 2016. So I think the work of Nathan and what everybody else is doing here, the digital world of producing dictionaries, that has moved that conversation on, but that's where it began, in the Anglophone world. So I have physically continued to encounter both Ngugi and the late Professor Achebe during my own literary work and scholarly work, and this has had a very profound impact on my being. In fact, it's transformed my life. I live my life in translation because of the literary work that they did. So I am me because of Achebe. I am me because of Gugi. So I'm therefore very honored to be here, and I'd again like to congratulate the organizers. As I said in my Agnipa, I am Igbo, and I'm not Igbo. And I will leave it at there and leave it as a thought for you. I also wanted to talk on something that I want to call cosmopolitan consciousness. Because we are here in London, it might be more difficult to talk about this in Nairobi or Nigeria in the way that I'm going to talk about it here, not because it's impossible. I live in Africa, actually, so I wouldn't talk about it the way I'm going to talk about here, and that's a translation issue. But I wanted to talk about cosmopolitan consciousness because even our gathering here at SOAS is part of a testimony of what I wish to say, that this can happen mainly only in London for a reason. Think about it hard and think about where a meeting like this would be happening in a university with 100 years history, I think I saw outside. And we are here, a room predominantly full of African people, and not just African people, but predominantly Igbo people. Think outside Nigeria, where else such a thing could happen but London? And not even in the shires out there. I'm sure it could, but it hasn't happened, and this is very unique. So I want us to think about what this cosmopolitan consciousness that makes us wake up on a Saturday. It's not a church. It's not, we didn't have that lovely food that Mama pot. That's not what brought us, although it would have been wonderful. It wasn't the jollof rice we had upstairs that brought us here. But we're here because we want to think about culture and identity. So I also wanted to say that our world is fused with the colonial heritage and understanding, which ironically and paradoxically provides our Pan-African understanding. And it is actually our acceptance of this unintended paradox of coloniality and the anti-colonial struggles that we have this cosmopolitan consciousness. So I believe that it's embedded in the philosophical work, knowledge, and contribution that, as I said, was led by people like Achebe and others before him. And we were very touched yesterday listening to a talk on the music of Samuel, what's his name, who was here? Yes, and just seeing that these traditions were there across disciplines. It wasn't just in literature, but there were people thinking about fusion of music and art and other art forms. And it would be, for me, very wonderful to hear more about these rich experiences. And I want to come back to that as to why we are only now discovering a wonderful musician, for me anyway, such as Samuel, and why this material, so much material we saw, and nobody is celebrating it. I mean, and all the DJs who were here apologize for not having bothered, because we take these things for granted. And in my language, we say, "Erago yari dia yakua," and that means that we only say that a cow was of value when it dies because we miss its milk. So those are some of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of just the cosmopolitan consciousness, which is not, will lead me to the next point that I want to talk about, which is about what is translation and traduction. And I think most of what you saw in that panel, the last one on religion, was about translation and traduction. And I want to thank all the speakers because they did all my work for me. And you saw the minute we started discussing meaning and sense-making of one word only, chinek. Is it chinek? Chineke. The room went wild. And if we did that with all the words, the room would go even wilder. So, of course, it was very wonderful to hear this whole concept of the evolution of language because of our interaction with others. And, of course, we saw the biased expansion of the Igbo language such as the introduction of the concept of the devil, which is common in all the colonized cultures. I was going to put up my hand and say something, but I thought I shouldn't steal the time, as I'm privileged to have this time. But I wanted to say to you that in Kikuyu culture, it's a matrilineal culture, and the word for the creator is given to a deity, Mombi, who's a female deity. And of course, the colonials could not give that word, which is the equivalent of creator, because it would have a female attribute. And as you know, God, the image of God that we are familiar with, the Anglophone version of it is a white, male, bearded, blue-eyed guy, of Jesus anyway. But so of course, by deduction, his father probably, we're made in the image of God. And please, Father, who's in the room, forgive me. And the one in heaven. So I think we can extrapolate that the one in heaven looks a little bit like that one. But so they couldn't translate this into this female deity. Mombi is the word, Mombi, and it means creator, and it's in other meanings it means creator, as in producer of material things, and I'll come back hopefully to that, because I want to talk about Barry that Obi spoke about yesterday. So I think that going back to this question of English language and the expression of Igbo writers and performing artists, I've claimed in my research that that moment that Achebe represents is the cultural turn for the African Renaissance. And it occurred at that point of fusion of writers like him in translation, where he fused Igbo narrative tradition with the English novel in what I have called an invisible translation. Later, towards the end of his life, Professor Achebe did start to talk about translating his works, but he said, and I agree with him, that he's not sure that the book that would emerge in Igbo is the book that he first wrote in English. He said that would be a different book. I think he's been interviewed. I spoke to him in this very room, and also he's spoken in an interview in Sahara with Oken Dibe and a few others, and he has said he wished to translate it himself into Igbo, and then of course which Igbo, Northern, I mean I don't want to go into that, but which dialect, I don't want to, my door is still there. So which dialect of Igbo was he to translate it in? But he provided the Anglophone writer writing in any language, including their mother tongue, and this is increasing, as I said earlier, with a voice with which to speak. And what Bell Hooks has said, this is the master's voice, yet I needed to speak with you, because we do need to speak to each other. But Achebe and others ensured that it was not the master's language, and indeed that it was our own language, and that brought the African landscape and reality into the norms, and that's what I've called the cultural turn. It's a big pivotal moment in Pan-African history. So I've theorized this as something I call discovery and recovery, and I'm naming them because it's something that has transpired here in this conference, that we don't know a lot of things, and we are learning a lot of things. I have definitely learned a lot of things, but also the whole idea of recovery, both with and without a hyphen, that we have to cover some things which are not of value to us, and we have to recover some of the things. So for example, anyway, I won't go to that example. It only cause trouble. But anyway, I wanted to say that Anthony Kwame up here, in talking about cosmopolitan conversations across cultural, political, and social, and economic, and religious boundaries, is not just about conversion. It's about learning as well as teaching, and it's about listening as well as talking. He also goes to say that a word isn't a word without the reality. So for example, that chi that emerged with Christianity only emerged in that reality of Christianity, and it is real now. But before that moment, in the Igbo language, it was not there. It didn't exist, but the minute it interacted with Christianity, it was born. And it's a new concept in the language. We now, in my language, have the concept of devil, which we didn't have. We had the concept of spirit, a good spirit and a bad spirit, like in Igbo. But now we have this other guy with horns and red whatever as he's represented and burning somewhere. We didn't have that idea. And we had our own modes of retribution here on earth. We didn't wait to die to pay the price. You paid here, which I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. So I wanted to move to another notion of intimacy and authenticity. Again, a lot of people in the room have been talking about the real Igbo and going like this. And I wanted to ask what that gesture meant. And it's what I'm questioning. What is the point? Not what is the point, but what is that point that makes it authentic at that moment? Is it my claim of it being authentic, or is it a collective understanding that makes it authentic? And I wanted to talk about the idea of both Igbo citizenship, or any citizenship, through this notion of cosmopolitanism as a wider concept. And I wanted to talk about intimacy, which is what I think we saw with food, that we're intimate with food. We touch it, we eat it, we sense it, it's intimate to the body. And that's how we identify that this is me and this is what I love. And that makes me authentic in that love for that food. But I've argued elsewhere, and somebody else said it here, I'm sorry, I don't remember who, that as we travel more, as we engage with the internet, as we live in cities like London, we are more and more likely to eat more akara and those moi moi and lovely things that make everybody who eats those things experience that authenticity. And I want to pay tribute again to my brother, Ezenwa, Charles Umelo, because at the time I was ill in hospital and I thought that I was going to die. And he brought me a bowl of, what was it? Moi moi? It was moi moi. And I thought, now I could die and go to heaven happy. So I want to thank you very much. It was very uplifting. And I said, I have to live because I've got to continue eating this wonderful food. So there's the whole question of the diaspora. And we've heard a lot about it because that's a space we occupy, particularly the young people who are born here. They're people who are born of mixed heritage, who've never been to Nigeria, may never go to Nigeria. I hope they do. And that they are experiencing this culture as authentically their own. And it's real for them emotionally and psychologically. They don't feel other. So, and I hope I'm saying the right thing. And there is an originality even in that diasporic authenticity. And that we must not see these as different spectrum, one the original and the other as a derivative. But as I said, I'd like to invite us to see this as a continuum of one, and that they each enrich each other in ways that are very difficult to tell. We cannot measure it, like this wonderful food that the person had to go to Nigeria and was invited and felt a bit intimidated to go to the source country to actually teach people how to cook. And that fascinated me because it's what I'm saying, it's a continuum, and rightfully so, it's good to have that little hesitation, but please let's not have that hesitation for too long. But it's polite and correct to have that hesitation, just as we interact with people at home. We can hope and aspire that they too will also have a little pause of reflection when they interact, when they interact with us, because we are also bringing something unique to them. The next point that I want to touch upon is on community, and it's been spoken about here, and it's linked to that point of intimacy, that community is formed in places like the diaspora, and increasingly on the continent, especially in the cities. Community is formed by choice. We choose to come here on this Saturday to form this community. And this, for me, is the most powerful definition of the idea of community, not coerced. Nobody forced us to wake up today. When we go to church, nobody forces us to go to church. When we go, well, to school, sometimes our parents force us to go to school. But the whole idea of an accepted notion that's acceptable. Of course, these communities can break down, but I'm more interested in the communities such as this one, which are created consciously by people. And I wanted to pay tribute to Obi Okigbo, who spoke yesterday, and to say to her that we wish her a speedy recovery and that we miss her not being here. But I commend the fact that she committed her father's work to UNESCO as part of global heritage. So her work is held in patronage for all of us, for the whole world. Although it emanates from a specific locus, it belongs to the whole world. And although it's particular and specific, it's also universal and global at the same time. And I like this idea of community. But more, what I was touched by is this notion of Mbari, which was described as ephemeral, but continuous, it's physical, and it recreates a physical, performative, engaging, and collective art form. And in this particular case, it has a site, a physical land site, and also a persona is embodied in her, and of course in the Mbari association, from which she's drawing inspiration. So I'd like to share with you and to continue my deep belief that our continued discovery and recovery of knowledge of ourselves through such institutions of such knowledge and cultural practices and ties are important. And I've already talked about the work of William Anyebo, who I won't talk about, but I feel increasingly as a person of a certain age that what we saw there of William's work is just a snapshot of all the archives that the generation before us and our generation have. These archives. They're rotting away, they're being eaten by termites, and some of them are like film reels that were made in the 50s and 60s. They're just rotting because of the heat and they're badly stored and so forth and so on. And we're reinventing life like the people before us didn't think of very far forward-looking things. Like William, we heard he was already doing Afrofusion a long time, techno music a long time ago, long before the kids were doing hip-hop and we were raving because of the different medias that came into play. So we don't know what's happening because the internet at the time didn't exist. Some of these people like him are reclusive. And I've seen physically with my own eyes huge, vast amounts of archives that we need to recover. So this notion of recovery is a serious recovery because it's also linked to our present knowledge of where we are and where we ought to be going. So the last idea that I'm going to share with you is the whole idea of membering and remembering. Membering and remembering. Because of the tragic events of history, of the African person, both on the continent and in the diaspora, the work of piecing together ourselves and our bodies remains an important piece of work to do both at material and non-material level. So in paying tribute to the idea and the reality of the Renaissance, my work is interested in the notion of présence africaine as a wider, deeper concept where we can claim and learn and know each other's work. And I know in the African Union's Vision 2063, this whole idea of remembering and knowing our past, our collective African past, is an important part of that vision. And I think this conference is an important building block for that kind of work. So I think that we should do more cross-cultural work. I hope and pray that the dictionary can find itself to other languages. I've already volunteered to do a Kikuyu one, and I hope other people from other cultures will continue to build on this work. I want to pay tribute to my work is actually inspired by a woman called Diana Ferris, who you might know. and who took the body of Sarah Baartman home. Do you know the story of Sarah Baartman? So she wrote a poem, a simple poem, and it was called I've Come to Take You Home. And when she wrote that poem, it was not a material culture, it was just a poem, but it was words that actually produced action that enabled her and the government to come to Europe and claim the disembodied parts of Sarah Baartman and take them home and offer them in burial to the community with which she had emanated. And for me, this is the depth of translation, that she had already been translated from South Africa. Her body had already been translated into negative forms. Her body had actually been disembodied when she died. They cut up her body into different pieces. So the task of taking her home meant putting her body back together and making her a person again, because they did preserve her body parts in the museum. So they were able to piece together her body, not perfect as she would have been when she lived, and for which she became a spectacle, but still there was some justice, which is the last word that I'm going to say on this. And it's known that through that work that Louisa talked about, that we do with the translation, we do this work of deep translation, not just the words, although the words matter a lot, but we look deeper. Like I'm interested in my Igbo origins, for example, and my Kikuyu origins, and in my diasporic origins. And I live now in Abidjan, so I'm looking for myself there too. And we've had, in some of the seminars, we've looked at work of people like Rizwan Hani, who looks at old Egyptology texts and translates them to the modern day, so we're able to see what the predecessors of Egypt thought, what he can read the ancient language. And we've seen from the scholar Josephine Balmer's work that she has been looking at the papyrus, and from the fragments that we find, she's able to piece, just by logic, the bit that's missing, you can piece together and work out the sentence, although the papyrus might be missing. So there are people like Maureen Roberts, who works at the London Archives here in London, and she had a wonderful exhibition recently on people who, one of them is living and the other one has passed away. And they brought to life the shop that was owned by Jessica Huntley and her husband. And it's recovering and performing these spaces like Zambari, that is now a real physical space that Obi is trying to create, that we can create this sense of justice for the future, if we're going to live with ourselves in ways that are peaceful and that we're happy with ourselves. The last thing that I'm going to do, I know I said that I would, that was the last thing, but that wasn't quite so true. Are you awake? Yes. There's another one piece of paper, but because I know that my sister, Joki, are you here? Oh, there you are. Because you're here, I was not going to do this at length, but now I'm going to do it with flourish, and I'm going to read you the first paragraph of Achebe's chapter 1 of Things Fall Apart. Okonkwo na wikaine wega, isagine ciothe kenda, ona kuraya raya gukira ugu, no umenyo wake waikarire hinya wake omwe. Rĩrĩa arĩ na mĩaka 18, nĩareheire igweta itũũra rĩake, tondũ nĩahotire kũrũnda Amalinze, nyau ĩrĩa yetagwo Amalinze. Amalinze arĩ njorua mũrũdani, na mĩaka 7 atũire atarĩ ahotwo nĩ mũndũ, kuma na kũu ũmũofia kinya Baino. Etagwo Kanyau kana Nyau, tondũ mũgongo wake ndwahutagia thĩ. Na nĩ mũndũ ũcio Okonko arũndire hĩndĩ ĩrĩa marũire, na mũndũ ũcio mũkũrũ nĩwe warĩ njorua kuma kĩambĩrĩria kĩa itũũra rĩu, na nĩanyitanire na ngoma njega na kũu mahuti-inĩ Viku Mogwaja, na Matuku Mogwaja. Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing Amalinze the cat. Amalinze was the great wrestler who for 7 years was unbeaten from Umofia to Mbaino. He was called the cat because his back had never touched the earth. It was this man that Okonkwo threw in a fight, which the old man agreed was one of the fiercest since the founder of their town engaged a spirit of the wild for 7 days and 7 nights. So, to conclude, our stories, our proverbs, our emblems, our art, our thoughts offer us a route to meaning and memory. But first, we must know where to find these treasures. We must learn to decipher them and apply them to the present and the future. We must find safe ways of closing the colonial bracket and continue imagining those futures that Nelson Mandela and many of our predecessors already began to pave the way. As I said, I see this conference building on those legacies. Our world and reality requires us to react swiftly to the call of our time. Our time will be the past of the future. What we create now, people will look back to as an authentic past of Igbo-ness. They'll say 200 years ago, the Igbo people met in London at SOAS. So we have a duty to create the now that will pave the way for a just future. And we will pave the trajectory of history, not one of the 19th century or earlier encounters, although these are important as they have laid the foundation of our reality today. And they call for what I have argued as situational ethics, which means that we take our context, our knowledges, and our location in London, in Lagos, in New York, in Abidjan, wherever Igbo people are, where African people are, where human beings are, one of forging a common humanity, and I think the word solidarity was used with our neighbors far and wide, our families, our friends, and our colleagues. This calls for knowledge and forming communities based on these knowledges. So I'm very encouraged by this recovery of Igbo culture here in London. And I pray that it offers us entry points in which to share our knowledge and cultures so that the Pan-African Renaissance is not based on wishful thinking, but rooted in knowledge of our collective cultural cultures and their connections with the global cultures as we're experiencing them through Afrobeats and Afrofuturistic speculative fiction, such as that which is pioneered by writers such as Nnedi Okorafor. My friend said to me today, on the Renaissance, for me, the rebirth of Africa is multi-layered. It's not a fad or a euphoristic state of mind, but a position of reversing policy injustices, cultivating a cohort of people that are secure in this identity as African, redeeming the African epistemology from the grip of colonialism that for centuries has pushed us to see the world through the Western eye. It is the total decolonization of mind, curriculum, and practice. Her name is Professor Zodwa Motsa from South Africa. And on this note, I thank you.